Well, Nick Saban had a lot to say. Nick Saban had a lot to say about the Dogs' win over Michigan. The number one thing that I picked out about it was he said that Georgia was dominant in their win over Michigan, and that's true. I mean, Cincinnati kind of hung around with Alabama. I wasn't surprised by that at all, but the way that Georgia beat up Michigan was something that Nick Saban and company took note of, and it's good and bad if you're Alabama, because what you're trying to do is get your guys ready to play a team that you just really beat very solidly not that long ago, a team that you have won. I was about to say dominated, but they've not dominated Georgia since Kirby's been there. They've won 4 games, and you know those 4 games have not at all been walks in the park. So this is going to be a challenging week for Nick Saban, getting his team's mindset right after a while of not playing great for their standard. Alabama had played their best game of the season against the Dogs, and then played okay against Cincinnati. I thought it wasn't what they did against Georgia. That's for sure. It was much more like they've been during the season. Now, don't confuse yourself. They have not had a bad year. They have had a year that has been what I would say up and down for what they're used to. I mean, at the beginning of the season, obviously a couple of lopsided wins against Miami and Mercer. And then getting into October, well, getting into the middle part of the season, um, the real fight with the Gators, a 2-point win over them down there, that was not great, but it was indicative of how up and down Alabama's season would be. More up than down, don't get me wrong. They seem to get everything right against Southern Miss, and then a solid win over the Rebels, which people thought would be a real fight. And then against Texas A&M, they lost the game. They did not play well. I mean, that was the statistics were there, but that was I thought the whole time they were playing that game that Alabama would win. And we were at Auburn. That was a big, solid victory for Georgia. And they just didn't play the way that I thought they would. And in fact, and you can't really do this because it goes to show it doesn't matter. The SEC championship game is proof that it doesn't matter. But the 4 teams that Georgia and Bama share opponents with, Georgia beat those teams worse. I mean, they beat Florida worse than Alabama. They beat Tennessee worse than Alabama. They beat Arkansas worse than Alabama, and they beat Auburn worse than Alabama. So obviously, comparatively speaking, you can't do that. That's not a thing. But it goes to show again, you go up and down. They don't play well against A&M, then they play really well against Mississippi State. It takes them a while to get going against Tennessee, and then they play a game that they nearly lose at home to LSU. I mean, they didn't seem right in November, Alabama. And then the New Mexico State game, obviously a joke. They had a real fight with Arkansas, but Bryce Young threw for almost 600 yards in that game. They only won by 7. And then obviously the game with Auburn, where I mean they certainly could have lost or should have lost. So Georgia and Alabama have not had the same types of years, and we're going to see now if Georgia can step up to the plate and play the way they have in 13 of 14 games. I mean, we're at the pivotal moment here where Georgia's got to play well. Everybody knows that, but it's time to do it. And Nick was saying, hey, they were completely dominant against Michigan, with the exception maybe of the Clemson game and the Alabama game. And Georgia was dominant against Clemson, just not on offense. So if the season returns to form, it is certainly reasonable for people to expect Georgia to win this game. And we are just at a point where nobody wants to allow that to enter their imagination. It's kind of silly, really, how difficult the links at which people, Georgia fans mainly, are going to say, oh, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't, well, it doesn't matter what it sounds like. It's not like the 2015 game where it made no sense that they were favored. This makes sense because of the way they dominated Michigan. I mean, I did Leggy's thoughts uh, way after the game, and we had such a long game, night game on the road. We didn't get out of the Orange Bowl until we didn't get back to the hotel until about 2 o'clock, I think, or 1:30, whatever it was. It was a disaster. And the bowl games are always that way. So I didn't really get a chance to totally zoom into how bad Georgia had dominated Michigan, but it was a total whipping. And that's what Nick's talking about. It wasn't just the score. I mean, the score was one thing, but really more than anything, it was just how much they took away the run game from Michigan, how much how well Stetson played against Michigan. I'm trying to find the statistics here to prove my point. Stetson, 313 yards. They throw for 331 total. The other throw was for a touchdown. They ran for 190 yards against Michigan. Do you remember how much we heard about Michigan's defense, particularly the pass rushers coming in this game? I don't think they had a sack. Uh, you know, Michigan run game, 91 yards. 91 yards. No quarterback from Michigan had over 131 yards. So it was a solid whipping, and that's what Nick's talking about. Now, why is he talking about it? Because he's doing what he does. He's getting his players' attention through the media. Kirby does it the same way. And so we will have the coaches this week, I think 3 times before they actually play this game. And ESPN will have them a slew of times. So it'll be interesting to watch um, the coded messaging from these two programs. I mean, only once have these two with the two current coaches. Only once have they played one another in a regular season game. All the other games were with someone hoisting a trophy, an important trophy at that. The interesting thing in this one is we have the inverse of the 2017 situation where Alabama had not won the conference championship and got their way into the college football playoff, only to play a Georgia team that had won the conference against Auburn a few weeks earlier. The difference also, too, is that Alabama didn't play in the SEC championship game, so they got an extra week of rest. I think Georgia, coming into this game, looks in good shape. Injury-wise, we've not heard anything on that front, but we'll hear a lot of stuff on Monday. Monday and Wednesday are big days for media obligations for this, and Saturday and Sunday as well before the game. But Nick was right to be impressed with the Dogs. They looked really good. Alabama looked good too. They just didn't look as good as Georgia did. Does that matter at the end of the day? Probably not. I mean, each game is its own thing. I mean, you wouldn't say you would rather be LSU, excuse me, for the season. What's come up lately more than anything is Alabama's defense has turned a corner. I mean, they're playing well. They played well against Georgia. Georgia still scored 24 points, but Cincinnati was shut down completely. I mean, just slightly over 200 yards, and with Alabama almost at 500. So the score didn't look as dominant, but and just watching the game, Alabama, it took them a second or two to get going. A 17-3 lead, it didn't, it, I don't know. That's probably what it was. I mean, the score was about right. It was harder to watch the second half because of Georgia getting ready to play, but that game was 17-6 going into the fourth quarter, and Alabama kind of snuffed them out at the end. But Georgia did look good. Nick Saban's right. Why he's saying that? He's trying to get his guys' attention. We'll see if he can do that. We'll see you over on the website, dogpost.com. Thanks for watching, dogpost.com. We'll see you over there.